Rick, at best, the U.S. is keeping Ukraine and Europe guessing as to whether or when they'll be involved in these peace negotiations. Why do it this way?
I don't know, Ali. I don't know if it's a strategy or lack of confidence, but you know, there's an old saw that all wars end in the same place, at the negotiating table. But this war won't end at the negotiating table unless the parties to the conflict are at the table. I mean, it seems absurd to me to not have Ukraine be part of these talks. By the way, if they're not part of the talks and there's a decision between Russia and the United States, Ukraine could say they're not going to do it. I would also add it's absurd not to have the European Union or NATO at the talks. I mean, by my reckoning, Europe has given about the same amount to Ukraine as the U.S. has, about $80 billion. Ukraine is a part of Europe. In fact, it's the largest country in Europe, bigger than France. So I think they have to all be parties to the talk, because remember, you can come to an agreement, and if people don't accept it and don't execute it and don't act on it, it's not an agreement. And that won't happen unless Ukraine and Europe are in some way at the table.
And Zelensky already making the point. He's not going to agree to anything unless he's at that table. You've also got UK leader Keir Starmer referring to this as a once-in-a-generation moment for national security. So, Rick, what are you going to be watching for out of the other summit that's happening, this one, the emergency summit in Paris today?
You know, Ali, you mentioned this in the kind of lead up to this story. I mean, the Europeans are facing a different kind of reality now. I mean, you know, the distance between Europe and America has always been small. Europe has always had a relationship with the U.S. And Mr. Macron has been talking for years about Europe has to beef up its own defense. It has to be more autonomous. And I think that's what they're going to be talking about, certainly during this final Trump term. And I'm looking for them to either make more commitments to Ukraine, pick up some of the slack that will inevitably happen with Trump in power. So it'll be interesting to see, and they'll be making their case for why they need a place at the table as well.
When it comes to paying more for defense, that's one of the things that I've heard as a potential silver lining here. But, Raf, I want to play a little more from Zelensky over the weekend. Listen to that.
Is it true that you told President Trump during that phone call that Putin is only pretending to want peace because he is afraid of Mr. Trump?
Yes. Yes, I said that he's a liar. And he said, I think that my feeling, he said, that he's ready for peace negotiations. And I said to him, no, he's a liar. He doesn't want any peace.
So, Raf, as far as Ukraine is concerned, are these talks a step forward or not really?
Ali, the Ukrainians are worried about every aspect of these talks, from the format to the timing to the concessions being discussed. So, format, Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Saudi Arabia bilaterally. The Ukrainians not at the table. Rubio has said these are not the real negotiations, but the Ukrainians very concerned that this is an indication that they are going to be shut out of those real talks when they finally begin, and that they are basically going to be handed some kind of deal hashed out between the Kremlin and the Trump administration. They're worried about the timing. The Biden administration's position, the position of most of the other NATO allies, was it was up to Ukraine to decide when to go into peace negotiations, and it was the role of the Western countries to put Ukraine in the strongest position on the battlefield going into those talks. That is not the position of the Trump administration. As you heard there from that sound from the president, they are talking about a very accelerated timetable for moving into these negotiations, whether or not Ukraine is on the back foot on the battlefield. And then in terms of concessions, you have had American officials, including U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, speaking at NATO last week, talking very publicly about the kinds of concessions that Ukraine is going to have to make in these talks. They are saying Ukraine is going to have to give up its goal of recovering all territory lost to Russia since 2014. So that's not just the territory lost since the full-scale invasion in 2022, but also areas like Crimea. They're saying Ukraine needs to give up on its goal of becoming a member of NATO as part of these peace talks. The Ukrainians and, frankly, a lot of the NATO allies are very frustrated that the U.S. seems to be making concessions on Ukraine's behalf in public before these talks even begin, while at this point they are asking very little from the Russians. Ali.
That frustration also echoed by at least one Republican senator, Roger Wicker. Raf Sanchez, thanks for joining us. Rick, I want to come back to you because I want to ask about this Trump proposal that is out there around Ukraine granting the U.S. access to half of its rare earth minerals in exchange for ongoing military support. Here's NSA Mike Waltz talking about that on Fox over the weekend.
The American people deserve to be recouped, deserve to have some type of payback for the billions that they have invested in this war. President Trump is rethinking the entire dynamic here. That has some people uncomfortable, but I think Zelensky would be very wise to enter into this agreement.
Now, NBC News has learned that since Waltz made those remarks, Zelensky told aides to reject that U.S. offer. But that being said, there's a lot of Americans that would probably agree that the U.S. should get something in return for America's military support. But what's the downside to making diplomacy and alliances transactional in this way?
Well, Ali, you use the word that represents the Trump foreign policy. It's completely transactional. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, our foreign policy since World War II, beginning with the Marshall Plan, where we gave billions of dollars to help Europe heal, without it being transactional, without expecting anything in return, except for what we got. A peaceful Europe for 75 years, a prosperous Japan, a prosperous Germany, a prosperous France. That's a pretty great dividend, I would say. And the dividend of any peace agreement and what we've done to support Ukraine, of having peace in Europe, of having Ukraine be part of Europe, of having Russia be kind of more locked down and not invading other countries in Europe, that's an enormous dividend. But if we can get some access to rare earth minerals in a way that is not a kind of a colonial relationship with Ukraine, I think that's fine. There's nothing, on its face that's wrong with that. But I do think the dividend of peace between Ukraine and Russia, Russia contained Europe, Ukraine part of Europe, that's a pretty darn dividend by itself.
The umbrella over all of this entire segment, is Trump's relationship with Putin. We are watching the second iteration of it coming into public view now in these early weeks of the Trump administration. But we've heard the concern from Europe that the U.S. is shifting away from them. Of course, once again, we see the Putin-Trump relationship in the spotlight. Is this really the defining relationship of the Trump foreign policy era? And what's the impact of that?
Well, Ali, how much have we talked about this over the years? It's a kind of a black box, and I don't even want to speculate. But I think it's misaimed to think of Russia as a great power in the way that we did during the Cold War, which I think Trump still does. It's not a great power. Its economy is the size of Italy's. There are two hyperpowers in the world right now, China and the United States, and to focus on Russia is kind of a throwback. And I remember, Barack Obama alienated Putin when he said that, who buys Russian products? Russia is a gas station that sells vodka. And obviously Putin didn't like that. I think focusing on Russia to the extent of not focusing on China and not focusing on other global alliances is a mistake.